When Nancy finally decided to write her story on an internet forum for strangers, she was already 70 years old, and a profound silence filled the space where her family had once lived. She lived in an old brick house in a quiet London neighborhood, a few minutes from a park where squirrels grew accustomed to seeing her walk by every morning in the same beige coat. She managed the apartments and businesses her late husband had left her, a job that seemed elegant on the outside but, in practice, involved a lot of calling plumbers, arguing with insurance companies, and reviewing contracts with glasses that no longer allowed her to read the fine print. In the afternoons, 5 o'clock tea was always served in the same blue cup, chipped at the rim. The silence of the kitchen was filled only by the whir of the kettle and the news reports in the background. Despite all that orderly rhythm, there was a part of her that continued to revolve around the same void, a single son. Christopher, who lived in the United States, married, educated, successful, with whom conversations had been reduced to dry messages on important dates and quick calls, where both avoided what really hurt. At 54, when the chapter that changed everything began, Nancy felt strangely paused, as if her life were waiting for a role she hadn't yet been given. It was autumn 2016, and London was damp and gray as usual when she received a message from Christopher. Vanessa, his wife, had gone into labor. The news hit her kitchen like a glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. On one hand, through the cold screen of her phone. On the other, inside her. Suddenly, everything that had seemed static was filled with movement. She spoke with her agent that morning, canceled an important visit to a troublesome tenant, rescheduled a building inspection, and almost without thinking began searching for flights to the East Coast of the United States. It wasn't just, I'm going to meet my first, granddaughter. It was deeper. It was the intimate feeling that as a grandmother, perhaps she still had a chance to succeed, where she felt she had failed as a mother. As she printed the plane ticket on an old squeaky printer, she thought about tiny clothes, knitted blankets, the smell of a newborn baby, and silently promised herself that this time she wouldn't just stand by and watch life from afar. The flight from London was long, filled with crying children, lights that never quite turned off, and that unmistakable smell of reheated food that clung to Nancy's sweater, as if she herself had been microwaved. Even so, she traveled with a nervous energy she hadn't felt in decades. She carried in her bag a small yellow blanket she had secretly knitted at night, imagining her granddaughter's little hands clutching it someday. When the plane touched down in Boston, and then the train took her to Connecticut, the tiredness mixed with anxiety made each step off the platform feel like moving toward a place where something, at last, could be put right. As she walked through the parking lot looking for an Uber, she remembered the last time she had seen Christopher, almost 4 years ago, when an argument over money and pride had frozen everything between them. This trip was, for her, an attempt to thaw that ice. But when she arrived at the couple's house, something felt off from the very first second. Vanessa opened the door just a crack, her makeup flawless but her eyes tired like someone who hadn't slept, though not for maternal reasons. The house, large and bright, had that persistent artificial citrus scent of those who clean to impress, not to live. Nancy entered expecting to see a bassinet, a portable crib, a blanket, a bottle, any minimal sign of a newborn. But what she found was an impeccably tidy room, without a single object that suggested a baby. Her heart raced, but she chose to trust the kindest explanation. Perhaps the baby was sleeping in another room. Vanessa led her to the formal living room, the one no one used except for awkward dinners, and there was Christopher, sitting on the sofa like a lawyer waiting for his client. Nancy slowly took off her coat, not understanding why the atmosphere was so cold. And then, in a flat tone that I had never heard from my son, he said that the baby had been given up for adoption 5 days after she was born. Nancy felt the world shrink to a thick hum, like when you dive underwater and suddenly all voices become unrecognizable. She didn't understand the sentence at first. Her brain simply wouldn't process it. Christopher continued talking, using words like, logical decision, future, stability, while Vanessa nodded without looking at her, her fingers perfectly aligned on her beige skirt. When Nancy finally managed to speak, her voice trembled, almost childlike. She asked where her granddaughter was, why she hadn't been notified, what had happened. And then she heard the phrase that would haunt her for years. "She was born deaf, Mom. We didn't want a baby, defective." The word hit her like a bucket of hot acid. Vanessa chimed in to add that her family had standards, that the child would be better off with people prepared for those kinds of challenges, as if she were discussing the adoption of a sick puppy. Nancy felt something inside her snap like a dry twig. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't swear. What she did was get up from the armchair like someone recovering from an accident, still dazed, and plead for the agency's name, saying that she herself would adopt the girl, that it didn't matter if they had relinquished their rights, that the baby was her blood, her family. But Christopher and Vanessa didn't just say no. They revealed that they had already consulted lawyers to ensure that everything was sealed in closed records, impossible to trace. To avoid unnecessary emotional turmoil, Vanessa said, crossing her legs with a nauseating calmness. Nancy felt the air turn gelatinous. She couldn't breathe properly. She saw her son, the same one she had taught to ride a bike, the one who cried when he fell and sought refuge in her arms, speaking like a stranger, like someone who had torn away a part of himself to fit into a mold that wasn't his. And it was there, in that immaculate room where there was no trace of the baby, that Nancy understood she couldn't go back to London. Not without her. The following days were a kind of thick fog in which Nancy walked without feeling the ground beneath her feet. She stayed at a cheap motel near the station, one of those with carpets that smelled of musty dampness and ice machines that never worked. Every night, before trying to sleep, she opened the drawer where she kept the yellow knitted blanket for her granddaughter and held it to her chest as if it were physical proof that the child had existed, that she wasn't an absurd illusion created by her desire to be a grandmother. She called the state agency, spoke with indifferent bureaucrats who repeatedly told her that the case was closed and that without the consent of the biological parents, they couldn't reveal anything at all. Nancy began to wander the city like a ghost. She visited hospitals, churches, checked adoption lists, tried to bribe a receptionist who ended up threatening to call security. She didn't have a clear plan, only that burning certainty: I can't abandon that child. Thus began the life she never imagined for herself. She rented a small apartment in Connecticut, a cramped place with yellowed walls and a kitchen that could barely fit a woman, a kettle, and a persistent sadness. There she plastered the walls with maps, papers, calendars, phone numbers, business cards for private investigators she paid for with her savings, and a faith that seemed more fearful than rational. During that time, the loneliness was so thick that sometimes Nancy would talk aloud just to hear something human in the room. If you're reading this far, I'd love to know where you're reading from. In those years, it would have done me good to know that someone, somewhere, was listening. That was the truth. Nancy was searching for her granddaughter, yes, but she was also searching for ways not to disappear. And every day, without exception, she repeated the same phrase to herself before going to sleep. Someday I will find her. As the months passed, Nancy understood that it wasn't enough to simply search for the girl. She needed to prepare for the day, uncertain, improbable, almost impossible, when she would find her. So, one ordinary afternoon, while waiting for a weak coffee at a neighborhood cafe, she saw a poster advertising ASL classes, American Sign Language. She didn't hesitate. She signed up. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of frustration. Her hands seemed clumsy, stiff, unable to keep up with the other students. Sometimes she walked home through the wet snow muttering, "I'm too old for this," but she still practiced in front of the mirror, illuminated by a broken lamp that flickered as if accompanying her attempts. Over time, the signs ceased to be isolated movements and transformed into a bridge, a new language that brought her closer to a girl whose existence she didn't even know. It was a way of saying, "I'm here, even though you can't see me yet." And it was precisely by getting involved with the local deaf community that Nancy stopped feeling completely broken. She began helping out at cultural events, sitting with elderly people who used sign language with a grace that seemed almost choreographed, and listening, wordlessly, to stories that shed their very essence. A deaf teacher, with a white beard and lively eyes, once told her in sign language, "You will learn when you stop trying to control your hands and let them speak for you." That phrase stayed with her throughout her search. She visited more than 200 agencies, orphanages, schools, and foster homes. She traveled across entire states with her maps covered in colored pins, each one representing a no, a we don't know, a no record. Sometimes she returned to the apartment so exhausted that she slept on the sofa without taking off her shoes. But never, not even on the darkest days, did she consider going back to London. In her mind, real life was on hold until that little girl, deaf, unknown, probably lost in the system, crossed her path again. And Nancy, stubborn as a storm, was prepared to wait as long as it took. 12 years later, when Nancy's hair was completely silver and a weary serenity settled on her shoulders, the search seemed to have become part of her very being, something she did without thinking, like a vital reflex. She was 62 when one ordinary morning the apartment's landline, the one that almost never rang, began to vibrate. The number was from Virginia. On the other end, a social worker spoke in such a neutral voice that at first Nancy thought it was a mistake. But no. She mentioned a deaf 12-year-old girl named Ellen, who had been in an orphanage since she was 6 months old and had never been adopted. Nancy felt her entire body tense, as if every bone had received an electric shock. She heard the description: brown hair, fair skin, a small birthmark on her left collarbone, and something in her chest split in two. That birthmark. That damned birthmark. Christopher had an identical one. So did her husband. It was like a family seal that fate had placed there so she wouldn't doubt it. Even so, she requested a DNA test. She couldn't afford to have hopes that would later destroy her. When Nancy traveled to Virginia to meet Ellen, she walked with a mixture of terror and reverence, as if approaching a shrine. She met her in a simple room, lit by a huge window overlooking a yard with rusty swings. Ellen sat in a metal chair, her back straight, her eyes empty, like someone who had grown accustomed to expecting nothing from anyone. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore a sweatshirt that was far too big for her. When Nancy saw her, she felt that everything she had experienced, every flight, every motel night, every door slammed in her face, had led to this very moment. She spoke slowly, using imperfect gestures, introducing herself. Ellen looked at her suspiciously at first, then with a spark that Nancy recognized as a silent question. "Why are you here?" DNA confirmed it days later. She was her granddaughter. The child they had given up. The child the world had deemed defective before even giving her a chance to be loved. Nancy cried alone in a public restroom after receiving the result, resting her forehead against the cold wall, whispering, "I found you, my love. I found you." Adoption wasn't a quick or easy process. It was a silent battle, filled with thick files, lengthy interviews, and reviews that seemed designed to discourage anyone. But Nancy had been preparing for this moment for 12 years. She studied every document with the same care she used to cherish her husband's last memories, and she answered every question with a clarity born not only of truth, but also of a determination hardened by time. When she finally obtained legal custody, Ellen, who until then had barely reacted to anything, looked directly into her eyes for the first time and made a simple but devastating gesture. "Home?" Nancy nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat, aware that this word wasn't a logistical question but an existential one. She vowed not to let her down. The trip to London was a new experience for both of them. Ellen watched everything from the window: the plane, the nightlights of the Atlantic, the arrival at Heathrow with its chaotic movement. When they entered the old brick house, Ellen stood still in the hallway, touching the walls as if reading an unfamiliar texture. Nancy transformed an entire bedroom for her. She painted the walls a soft shade of blue, hung a lamp that projected images of the northern lights, and left the yellow blanket she had knitted 15 years before on the bed, still immaculate, folded like a vow she had never broken. The first few months were difficult. Ellen had outbursts of frustration, silent nightmares, moments of total disconnection. And yet every step forward, a new sign, a longer gaze, an unexpected laugh, was a treasure to Nancy. They enrolled in a specialized school, found therapists, deaf teachers, and the house began to fill with a language that didn't need words to be profound. Little by little, the broken girl began to transform into a teenager with her own strength. Over time, Ellen began to display talents that no one had had the patience to notice: an extraordinary sensitivity to visual storytelling, an almost poetic way of using sign language, creating stories that seemed to draw light in the air. Nancy watched her practice in front of the mirror, her hands moving with a mixture of precision and emotion that made each gesture seem like a verse. By 15, Ellen was already participating in ASL poetry workshops, and her teachers confirmed that she had a rare ability to convey images that transcended language. It was on one of those quiet afternoons in the living room, with Ellen practicing and Nancy organizing some documents on the table, that an email arrived that would once again alter the entire course of their lives. It was from Christopher. After 16 years of complete silence, the message was strange, too formal to be from a son, and too emotional to be professional. It said that he and Vanessa were in London for a few days, that they had adopted a boy, Gabriel, now an 18-year-old, and that the boy would like to meet his grandmother. Nancy froze in front of the screen, feeling old pains resurface, pains she had buried under layers of work, late motherhood, and reinvention. Ellen noticed the tension in her body and moved closer, reading the email beside her. The teenager frowned. She didn't know Christopher personally, but she knew enough to be suspicious. It was Ellen who suggested, "Don't trust him." And it was also Ellen who, that same night, seeing Nancy hesitate, gestured something that felt like both a dagger and an embrace. "I'm here. You don't need anyone who has hurt you." Nevertheless, Nancy agreed to meet, not because of Christopher, but because I wanted to know who this young man named Gabriel was, what he knew, what he was looking for, and why. Precisely now, when the wound was already healing. Gabriel turned out to be very different from what Nancy had expected. He didn't have the arrogance or the vacant stare she feared finding in someone raised by Christopher and Vanessa. He was a tall young man with dark, curly hair and a restless expression, as if he were constantly analyzing whether he was saying the right thing. They met in a small cafe in Kensington, and before Nancy could even offer him tea, he apologized. Not for his own behavior, which had been respectful, but for his parents. He confessed that he had been receiving instructions for weeks on how to speak, how to behave, how to show affection, in order to get Nancy to help them financially. They called it the family plan. At first, Gabriel hadn't questioned it, but something inside him began to tense up when he saw Vanessa rehearsing phrases in front of the mirror, polishing emotions that were never real. And when she found a file in Christopher's office, with empty bank accounts, debts, and a shady history of her maternal grandfather, accused of fraud years before, she understood that his family outreach was nothing more than a desperate maneuver to use her as a lifeline. Nancy listened in silence, a mixture of indignation and an old sadness resurfacing. In the middle of the conversation, Gabriel asked something that chilled her to the bone. "Why did you never talk about the daughter you had before you adopted me?" Nancy's heart sank. Ellen, sitting next to her, felt the air thicken. With a gentleness unusual for a boy his age, Gabriel explained that he had once overheard Vanessa arguing with Christopher about The baby who would ruin the family's reputation if she ever showed up. He never understood what they meant, until that moment when he saw Ellen silently watching him, with that mixture of strength and vulnerability that only someone scarred by profound abandonment can carry in their gaze. And it was there, right at that small table, when Ellen raised her hands and pointed to something Nancy had never imagined hearing so soon. "It's me." No embellishment, no ceremony, just the truth. Gabriel's eyes widened as if he had just been struck by a harsh dose of reality that shattered his sense of self. And before Nancy could intervene, he began to cry silently, covering his face. It was then that she realized that this young man had also been a victim, albeit in a different way. That revelation was a silent earthquake that left all three of them frozen for long seconds. Gabriel, between sobs, tried to piece together thoughts that seemed to have collapsed like dominoes. He had grown up believing his parents were paragons of virtue, that adoption was an act of generosity, that the family history was without shadows. Now he was discovering that they had used him as a trophy when it suited them, as a tool when they needed it, and that, before him, they had already discarded a baby girl for being inconvenient. Ellen looked at him with a complex mix of emotions: compassion, anger, recognition. It wasn't easy to watch someone break down with a pain that had no name. Nancy placed a hand on Gabriel's shoulder, a gentle but firm gesture, like someone holding a glass before it shatters. The boy looked at her with glassy eyes and said something that pierced her heart. "I don't want to be like them." And Nancy knew that this boy was searching for something he had never had. A home not built on lies. After Siu. That conversation, it was clear that the time had come to confront Christopher and Vanessa. Gabriel insisted on going with them. He wanted to confront his parents, but he also wanted to show Nancy and Ellen that he was on their side. The three of them returned to the house in London to prepare for what would be an inevitable encounter, while Ellen practiced sign language in front of the mirror, not as training, but as a way to organize her thoughts. Nancy organized documents, the DNA results, orphanage reports, screenshots of messages, anything that would show the truth without room for manipulation. It was a dense, almost electric afternoon in which the air in the house seemed to anticipate something big. And in the midst of that charged atmosphere, Nancy felt a simple human need, the same one she had felt years before in her Connecticut apartment. And well, if this story is resonating with you in any way, don't hesitate to comment or share it. Sometimes you don't know how much. It can help if someone listens. Told softly, like someone who knows she's not telling her story just to herself, but so that there won't be any more silences like the ones she had to endure. The next morning, the four characters in this story, each with their own wounds, prepared for a night that would forever change the course of their lives. The night of the meeting arrived with a gray sky over London, heavy with the kind of humidity that makes everything seem heavier than it actually is. Nancy set the dining room table as if it were a ritual. Antique china plates, white candles, silverware polished to a shine. It wasn't a gesture of cordiality. It was a stage she controlled, neutral ground where the truth couldn't be hidden behind empty formalities. Ellen, in a simple dark blue dress, sat silently to one side, adjusting the fabric bracelet she wore to calm herself when the world became too much visual noise. Gabriel stood near the window, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the street, as if searching for the right words among the lit streetlights. When the doorbell rang, everyone held their breath. Christopher and Vanessa entered with that stiff posture of those accustomed to imposing their presence rather than asking for space. From the very first second, it was clear they had come prepared for a show. Vanessa wore an expensive dress, flawless makeup, and a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Christopher sported a suit far too formal for a family gathering. They sat down without waiting for an invitation. Nancy, with a composure honed by life's hardships, opened the evening without preamble. She declared that tonight there would be no lies, no half-truths, no convenient silences. She placed a thick folder of documents on the table. Vanessa laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound implying that this was melodramatic exaggeration. But when Nancy opened the folder and revealed the DNA report proving that Ellen was her biological daughter, the atmosphere tightened. Like a rope about to snap. Vanessa paled. Christopher swallowed, lowered his gaze, and avoided looking at the teenager who was watching him with an indescribable expression, a mixture of hurt and strength. And it was then that Nancy stepped back and allowed the true protagonist to speak. It was Ellen's moment. Ellen stood slowly, as if each movement required permission from a body still burdened with painful memories. She positioned herself in front of Christopher and Vanessa, and for a few seconds no one breathed. Then she began to speak in sign language with a devastating calm. Her hands moved with precision, with that poetic firmness she had learned over the years, constructing phrases that seemed to cut through the air. Gabriel interpreted aloud, his voice breaking, "I am not a mistake. I wasn't a problem. I was a child, a baby, and you discarded me as if I were worthless." Vanessa tried to interrupt, murmuring excuses about family pressure and fear, but Ellen raised her hand, a firm gesture, and continued, "I don't want you to apologize. I don't need it. What I want is for you to look at me, to see me, because you never did." Her signs were sharp, beautiful, sad. Nancy watched her from the head of the table, her eyes filled with tears. Not tears of pain, but of pride. Christopher, unable to meet his daughter's gaze, clasped his hands tightly in his lap. But Gabriel, trembling, decided it was his turn too. He stood up, staring at his parents. "You used me," he said, his voice cracking. "You lied to me. You made me believe this family had principles when all you had were self-interest." He pointed at Ellen. "She deserved love. So did I. But you don't know how to love anyone who doesn't benefit you." The tension at the table became unbearable. Vanessa stood abruptly, demanding respect, accusing everyone of ingratitude. Christopher finally exploded, trying to justify everything as difficult but necessary decisions. It was then that Nancy, from the other end of the table, spoke with a firmness she had never used before. She said that this home would not tolerate any more emotional violence, any more manipulation, or any more destructive silences. She told them, with undeniable clarity, that this was the end. And for the first time in many years, Christopher was silent, a silence not of authority, but of defeat. Vanessa tried to regain control of the situation, as she always did. She paced the table, gesticulating theatrically, accusing Nancy of having emotionally kidnapped Ellen, implying that the girl, now a teenager, was confused and manipulated. But every word she uttered only pushed her further down the ladder. Ellen stood firm, not backing an inch, her eyes fixed on the woman who had called her defective before she had even learned her name. Gabriel, meanwhile, instinctively moved closer to Nancy, as if searching for a moral compass he had never found in his parents. When Vanessa, in a final, desperate attempt, suggested that perhaps they could reach a reasonable financial agreement to resolve the family tensions, Nancy felt the pieces suddenly click into place. They hadn't come out of remorse, nor to heal wounds. They had come because they were broken and wanted to drag her down with them. The response was immediate. "My money isn't for those who destroy lives, it's for those who rebuild them." Christopher, who had remained with his head bowed, finally looked up at Ellen. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something that sounded human, but all he managed was a babble of disjointed phrases. No true apology could come from a heart that had never wanted to see her. And Ellen sensed this. With a slow, almost solemn movement, she made a final gesture which Gabriel translated in a whisper, "I don't hate you, I just don't need you anymore." That sentence pierced like a death sentence. Gabriel, in an unexpected move, announced that he wouldn't be returning to his parents, that he wanted to live with Nancy and Ellen, in a place where he could understand who he was without the suffocating expectations of a family built on lies. Vanessa lost her composure. Christopher begged her not to make any rash decisions, but it was too late. The truth had exposed all the cracks, and Nancy, her heart pounding as if she were 20 years younger, stood up and pointed to the door. "You can leave. This house is no longer yours." And so ended that chapter of a story that had been open for far too long. Oh, ChatGPT dies. When the door closed behind Christopher and Vanessa, the entire house seemed to exhale a long, drawn-out sigh, as if finally releasing years of tension that had built up in every corner. Gabriel slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He wasn't crying, but he had the expression of someone who had just seen his world rewritten in a matter of minutes. Ellen approached him slowly, unhurriedly, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up, still trembling, and she gave him a simple but powerful signal. "We're here. Not I'm here, not you're here, but we're here." A small word, but one that held a whole universe of new possibilities. Nancy watched them from the head of the table, feeling that finally, after years of searching, losing, rebuilding, and searching again, something inside her was definitively aligned. There was no boisterous victory, no celebration, only a warm, restorative silence that fills the chest when you understand that you survived something that could have destroyed you. The following weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments, deep conversations, paperwork, and a cohabitation that surprisingly settled in naturally. Gabriel moved into the guest bedroom of the London house. At first, he walked around as if afraid of taking up too much space, but little by little, he left traces of life everywhere: open notebooks, a half-finished mug of hot chocolate, a pair of slippers by the stairs. Ellen helped him learn sign language, chuckling softly whenever he mistook a gesture, and ended up saying something completely different. Nancy, meanwhile, watched them from the kitchen while making tea, and was surprised to find herself smiling without realizing it. That house, which for years had been a tidy but empty place, began to fill with conversations, quiet laughter, music Gabriel played in his room, and the comings and goings of two young people who could finally breathe without fear. For the first time in decades, the word family no longer felt too grand. It fit perfectly, and that, for Nancy, was the clearest proof that all the suffering had been worth it.